Things for sure about St. David was that he was certainly a minister of Christ, and he was a steward of the mysteries of God, and he was one faithful man. And so my theme for this morning is to look at St. David, consider his life, consider his faithfulness, and how he was faithful in the small things. God used him to be faithful in great things as well. And may God enable you and me to be more and more faithful to him, so that he too will use us for his glory, to be of service to other people, to be of service to him. David was born roughly between the year 500 and 520 in the year of our Lord, AD. No one's exactly sure of his date of birth. He was born into a noble family, a kingdom in Wales, roughly, I can't pronounce it properly, Kincardineshire, is that in Cardineshire? That's it, I can't say it properly, but that was a kingdom, and his grandfather was a king, and David was born a prince in the royal family. He was born with privilege, he was born into wealth, and born into a place in society, but he was God's man. He felt called of God to leave it all behind, and he did. Now that's a sacrifice. He gave it all up. In those days, the church was organised in monasteries. What happened was men were called of God and women called of God, and they would go and join a nunnery or a monastery, and there they would work to feed for themselves, and they wouldn't take money from the poor, and they gave. And then they would go out and preach the gospel. And David felt called of God to give up all his privilege, all his wealth, and his royalty. He gave it all up. And he became a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. He became a steward of the mysteries of God. The life of a monk was hard. It was part of the Celtic church, and if I explain it, but the church in Rome was beginning to exercise its authority over other churches around the world. And there was a fight back in many places, in Scotland, here in Cornwall, and in Wales. But the church in Wales was a Celtic church, and it was not about big buildings, it was about people. It was about preaching the gospel to the people and helping the poor and the needy. David became noted as being a real man of God. He was an anointed prophetic preacher. When he preached, they flocked to hear him. They came to him, and as Jan explained, they noticed that when David prayed, his prayers were answered. The Bible tells us in the book of James that the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, and it did for David, and people noticed this. So they kept on coming to him, asking him to pray for them. Medicine was in its infancy then. And he came to David and he prayed for the sick, and they were healed. John told the story of the man who was blind, and he was healed. Remember Jesus when he went to the village of Nain, and those of us who've been to Israel, we've been there. And remember he saw the widow of Nain, and her son had died, and he was brought out in the byre, and Jesus saw that, and he was full of compassion, and he prayed for the boy, and he was raised from the dead. Well, David did something similar, as John said. People noted that this monk, this David, was different from all the others. Because he was God's man. He had set himself apart for God's glory and not for his own. He had given up everything in life. As a monk, he even gave up Clyde. He even gave up drinking beer. So he drank Adam's ale. And his normal daily diet was bread and leeks. He gave it all up for the Lord. But the Lord used David for his glory. I can't pronounce the name of that place that you pronounced, John, where he was preaching. The crowds came to hear him. Wonderful, I'm glad you said it, not me. As he was preaching there, it was like a small earthquake happened. And there were hundreds there to see him, to hear him. And the land rose up where he was. Now, it's too easy to say that's just myth. It didn't really happen. It's too easy to say that. Historians are finding that many of the so-called myths that are said about Christian people turn out not to be myths at all. Two things. It's not right for Christians to tell lies. So why would all these followers of David and all these Christians make up these stories if they weren't true? And why is it that there's so many references to them? So there's something really going on there. It's more likely that these stories are true. And he was loved by the ordinary people in Wales. Now, he wasn't stuck in the monastery. He wandered around preaching the gospel. He came to Cornwall. He started the abbey at Glastonbury. He went over, as Jan said, into France, into Normandy, and was used of God there as well. But his passion was for the people of Wales. His passion was for the church in Wales. And he stood up against the Roman church pushing its agenda in Wales, and he tried to stop it, but sadly, later on, that's what happened. But his passion was for the people of Wales. Now, just so you understand the historical context at the time, the Romans left Britain in the year 420 AD. And after they left, the Saxons and the Angles and the Jutes came over to England, mainly to Kent, and Hengist was their king. And they wanted, now that the Romans had gone, they were invading England, as you know. And this is the time of the stories of King Arthur. Now, there certainly was a man called Arthur, and his name was Arturius. It seems as if there were 3 generations of these men, family linked. But the first one was a British Roman army military leader. We do know from history that in the year 490 AD at the hill of Baddock, we don't know where that is. Some people think it's up in Cumbria. Some Scots think it's up at Arthur's Seat in Edinburgh. But there was a famous battle where Arturius and the Celts and the Welsh, they fought against the Saxons, and they won a tremendous victory. And what happened was the Saxons were limited to their encroaching into England, and the Celts ended up on what we call the Celtic fringes of the British Isles: Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, Cumbria and Scotland. The Saxons took over the rest. So in David's time, the Saxons were continually trying to make inroads, incursions into Wales. And David was there with his people. Now, as you know, I was a military chaplain. Military chaplains are governed by the Geneva Convention. Military chaplains do not pick up weapons in war. And the thing is, when I was in the Navy, I loved the weapons. So I used to go with the lads for the training, and I was always told, you have to wait to the very end, and I would do the training. I loved it. But in battle, the chaplain's not allowed to pick up a weapon. But that was not the case in David's time. It used to be that the ministers of the gospel, they would go with the army and they would pray with them, but they would take up their sword and fight as well. Fascinating. When I was a student at the Baptist College in Scotland, I went over to the Baptist University in Europe, in Switzerland, in Zurich, for a conference, and I loved it. They were wonderful. And I was intrigued. There's what's called the Grossmünster, the big church in Zurich, and it's in front of it there's a huge statue of Zwingli. Zwingli was the Protestant reformer in Zurich. He was at the same time as Martin Luther. Now Zwingli was a real Protestant reformer. And at that time the Catholic armies were invading, and they were trying to capture Zurich, and they were going to kill all the Protestants. So Zwingli went out with the army, and he prayed with them. And the statue there is Zwingli with a Bible in one hand, and the battle axe in his other. Now that doesn't go down well with military chaplains today, but I'm sure David was like that. Anyway, this particular day, the Saxons were coming into Wales. They were in a field, and David was with the Welsh armies. The problem was the Saxons looked exactly like the Welsh. They were dressed the same. How do you know who's the enemy? And they were in a field, and it's full of leeks. And so David said to the Welshman, put a leak in your bonnet. Put it on your coat. And so you'll know who the enemy is. And to this day, the regiments in Wales, the Royal Regiment of Wales, will wear on St David's Day today a leak in their cap badge. And that's the history behind it. Now, in the notes here, I've given you about William Shakespeare's play Henry V. And in Henry V, at the Battle of Agincourt, one of his captains, Henry's captains, was a Welshman, and I'm not going to pronounce his name, and he's talking about leaks, and he says to King Henry, he said how in his grandfather's time, if you know your history, the famous Battle of Crécy in France, how the Black Prince, the Prince of Wales, Edward III, he praised his Welsh archers because they won the victory for him, and he noted then that the Welsh archers always wore a leek. So that's why Welshmen wear leeks on St David's Day, because of St David. He was a man of God, but he was a man for the people. He didn't live for himself. He didn't live for his own privilege. He didn't live for his own pleasures, for his own wants. He sacrificed everything for the Lord, and he did his best for others. He wanted to be faithful in the little things in life. He wasn't interested in pomp and splendour and fame and people liking him. He wasn't interested in that at all. He gave it all up. Now today, if you give all that up, you're called a fool, aren't you? Paul said that the apostles, they were fools for Christ's sake. And David was a fool as well in the eyes of the world, but he wasn't in the eyes of God. He gave everything up, but he loved the Lord, and he loved the ordinary people, and he wanted to do his best for them. And as Jan said, and as Louise said, his last words recorded was on the sermon he preached on the Lord's Day, the Sunday before he died, and the 1st of March was a Tuesday. And those words, as Joel's got up on the screen there, and they've become a phrase in Wales today. Do the little things in life. Copy his example. We are called by God to be faithful. Faithful in the small things that we do every day. And as we are faithful in these things, God will use us to be a blessing to other people. He will use us for his glory. Jesus said to be faithful in those who are faithful in the least things will be faithful in the greatest things. David was faithful in the little things in this life, and God used them to be faithful in the great things. Consider your life. What has God called you to do in your life? Maybe you can't do much for him physically. Maybe you're at an age, or you've got sickness, illness, and you're limited what you can do. But God has a plan for your life. He wants you to be faithful in the things he's called you to do. Maybe all you can do is take an interest in the lives of other people and pray for them. I've told you before about a friend of Belinda of mine, a man called Ron. Sadly, he's passed away. Well, not sad for Ron, he's up in glory now, but sad for Belinda and me, and he was a lovely man. He couldn't do much. He was an ill man. He was really housebound. He lived in Camborne, and he was in the Brethren. Just for John's, he was in the Brethren. But what he did, and he showed Belinda and me, he had a notebook, and he had over 200 names in a notebook, and Belinda and I were in it. And in the notebook, he had details about each people's lives, about what they're interested in, what they did. And he prayed every single day for these people. And when I first came here, he prayed for Belinda and me, and then he passed away. He prayed for us here every day, and it took him 2.5 hours to pray. What has God called you to do? Maybe God has asked you to be a worker in the church here. Maybe like Gwen, to stand at the door and welcome people. You know, it's a vitally important thing to do, is welcome people when they come into God's house. I hear of many churches where people are not given a welcome. Well, that's wrong. We've got to welcome people. Maybe God's called you to be a welcomer like Gwen. Maybe Gwen stands at the front door. Maybe you can stand at the inside door. Maybe God's called you to help on a Sunday with the food. Or send out the teas and coffees. Maybe God's called you to do something. Maybe God's called you to be a preacher and a teacher of the word. What has God called you to do? Maybe He's only called you to be a prayer warrior. But I tell you this, prayer is the most important thing of all. There's a story about the great preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon in the late 1800s. God used him. He was a mighty preacher, mighty preacher. He was in London in the Metropolitan Tabernacle, and Queen Victoria used to come and listen to him. Somebody came and asked him, he said, what's the secret to your success? And he says, it's not success, it's the Lord. We're here doing what the Lord wants. He said, but I'll show you something, come with me. And he went through to a back room, and he took this person, and in the back room, it was about 50 or 60 ladies in the back room. And he said, when I preach, these ladies have covenanted before God to be in the back room and they pray. And when they pray, things happen. Prayer changes things. Prayer changes things. Be faithful in the little things in life. Do the little things. Do the little things, and God will use you for greatness. Maybe not in this life, but certainly up in glory. And the greatest thing we can do is be of service to other people, to be of service to Him. May the Lord, something that's been said this morning, may be inspired by the stories of St. David. This man who gave up everything for the Lord. This man who truly believed and was faithful. May we become more like him, and may we give God all the glory for His name's sake. Amen. Let's pray.